Welcome to A Third Way. I am your host, Richard Garner. So what is a third way? Well, as the name implies, it's the space between dualism, let's say. And that is, the space between us versus them, this or that. I'm right, you're right. There's a lot of space in the middle that we need to occupy. And too often in today's public discourse, whether that be social media, mainstream media, whatever it is, you're kind of left with two options, and people seem to pick a side. And the world we live in is complex, it's complicated. We don't know as much as we think. And the only way to learn, the only way to understand other people, to develop empathy and humility, all the staples and the pillars of a harmonious coexistence in the world, it requires having conversations. It requires having conversations you might not want to have. Sometimes with people you don't want to have those conversations with. But if we're going to build bridges instead of walls, we need a diversity of opinions, a diversity of perspectives. And that's what we're going to try to bring to you as we sort of go down the rabbit holes of the fascinating, the unexplained, the underexplained. And a lot of talk is going to be about the future, because we are at an inflection point. I don't think a lot of people would disagree that a lot of things that are on the table right now are going to dictate the future years and decades of the world we live in. I think if we want to participate in that conversation, rather than have some, billionaires decide the course of humanity 2.0, then we need to come together. We need to create communities and movements that allow us to have adult conversations that allow us to expand our own horizons, be more objective, more understanding, and again, more empathetic. So today's episode brought to you by our friends at ZeroDB. What is ZeroDB? It's a drink, but it's more than a drink. I'd say it's a life solution in a stressed out world of high anxiety levels, and unfortunately, all too many options to caffeinate or lift your energy levels artificially. There aren't enough options. In fact, there are very few, if any, that actually help you quiet the noise. And that is what our friends at ZeroDB have brought to us. Again, it's not just a drink. I'd say it's a life solution. Go to drinkzerodb.com and find out where you can either order it on the website, or check the store locator. It's in Whole Foods and a bunch of stores probably near you. drinkzerodb.com, check it out and quiet the noise. So to start this new journey, I wanted to talk to someone who, for me personally, is one of my favorite people, but he really is an embodiment, let's say, of the spirit of a third way. He's a soulful dude. He's an interesting, wise, thoughtful person who has that rare ability to combine the esoteric, the sacred, and the sort of practical, real-world solutions that are required as we, again, embark on this sort of crazy journey of navigating good ship Earth to wherever that's going to go. So our first guest on A Third Way is Charles Eisenstein. I literally couldn't say enough about Charles Eisenstein, so I'll say this. If in 100 years or so the world has somehow found long-term sustainable peace and harmonious coexistence, I would not be surprised to find out that it was because of the work of Charles Eisenstein. Do yourself a favor, check out all of his books and essays, his TED Talks, his appearances on Under the Skin with Russell Brand. He's been out there for a while, but he's sort of gaining momentum as I think more and more people come to the work of Charles Eisenstein and understand the role it can play for all of us. As again, we try to embark on this journey of shaping, helping, creating, and co-creating humanity 2.0. And we now welcome Charles to the show. Charles, welcome to the debut episode of A Third Way.
Thank you, Richard. I'm honored to be on the debut episode.
Well, and it's it's truly an honor. I don't want to sound platitudinous, if that's a word, but it's an honor for us, because when you decide to do something like this, you're sort of building pillars. And for me, the impetus to do a show like this, it's born of times we're in, like anything, I guess, right? And one of the things that, started to be conspicuous by its absence, maybe at a higher level these days, was objectivity, open-mindedness, non-dualism in the sort of public discourse. And it certainly has been, it's almost cliche these days to say we're divided. Of course you could argue we've always been divided, but there seems to be an intensity and maybe even a hostility to where we're at today. And of course, we've been through historically some crazy times, COVID notwithstanding, as well as politically. So let's just start with you. How do you feel personally about, kind of what you've gone through over the last year, like everybody else, but kind of where we're at? Let's say that.
Yeah, it really depends on what day you ask me. I've gone through some pretty intense periods of despondency, and then also periods not so much of like optimism and everything is great, but periods where I feel really deeply resourced and capable of addressing our times, and not necessarily with anything grandiose, but the feeling of like I've got what I need to do what I'm here to do. And like if you're an artist, you don't complain if your canvas is smudged or you don't have quite the set of paints you'd like. You take what you have and you make the best art that you can. So that's kind of when I'm, in a good place. That's kind of my attitude. I'm like, okay, we got a challenge here. We've got quite a situation, and it's time to stop. It's time, if I can say this on air, it's time to stop fucking around and really get serious about why am I here and what can I do? What is mine to do? So,
and that applies. I mean, it's such a perfect way to say it, and perhaps not ironically, the best art that we see historically is often a reflection of the times, not just often a reflection of the times you're in, but often some of the best art is the result of suffering. It's the result of challenging times, of course, and what you have to do to grow through that. And I do see your work as let's call it philosophical art, because it has that non-dualistic aspect to it that is not so 2 + 2 = 4, although you seem to have a very rare capability to be able to speak to quote unquote practical, pragmatic perspectives, whether it be, books like Sacred Economics, etc., but also be able to sort of zoom out and I don't know, capture the soul. That sounds, that's not good enough on my part, but that there's something infinitely more non-dualistic at play here. And, the history of this particular species over the last few thousand years has definitely been a history of materialism. And I'm not saying that the catalyst of the times we're in is going to be, launching us into a utopian, sort of quantum period of our evolution. But I certainly would hope that history looks back at this time as being a bit of a BCAD period, as to a marker in history where we did start to your point, stop fucking around and get serious about some things that are clearly not working. When you say that, and when you think about that, what are the things that come to mind to you the most as to what needs to be addressed?
It all comes from embracing first that we have a purpose here, or that I have a purpose here, but also species-wide, like collectively. And second, asking what is mine to do in these times. So you mentioned materialism and how our culture has been very materialistic, and underneath what you were saying, and this is certainly in my work, it's a recognition that what we have seen as practical and realistic nuts and bolts solutions are coming from a conceptual tool set that's not big enough to address the crisis at hand, that we're kind of rearranging the decks on the Titanic, and that the healing that is necessary, or the revolution that is necessary, goes to such a deep level that you can only call it something like spiritual, which does not mean non-material for me. For me, it means that it broaches the forbidden questions, that it dissolves what we thought was real that it questions what we thought was possible, that it questions who we thought we were, why we thought we were here. Like, these are the questions. Spiritual doesn't mean non-material. It doesn't divide reality into two, the material and the spiritual. It is something that plumbs to those depths. It's those questions, like, why am I here? And we can ask that collectively. Why is humanity here? Like, is it to exploit, to maximize our security on this earth, to dominate other species, to dominate the planet, to conform matter to the image of our own desires? Or is there some other reason why humanity has been given these gifts? And I'm not sure, like, if you really want me to go so philosophical, but I think that these questions are unavoidable if we're not going to be rearranging the chairs in the Titanic. And everybody can, this is one reason why many people I talk to, and I have this history myself, when the big one approaches, the Y2K, the 2012, the financial collapse, like the COVID even, there's part of me that's like, yeah, baby, bring it on, because I want out of here. I want to be liberated from the structures that have confined us, the social structures, the economic structures, the psychological structures. And so COVID comes along, and along with, like, a lot of despair, a lot of suffering, not just the suffering of people who have been sick and have died and their families, that's there too, but also the suffering of people being locked down and masked and confined, and losing their jobs, losing their businesses, the tens of millions of children who are facing hunger because of all this in the world, stunted children, starving children. Like, this is massive suffering. And there's also maybe part of us, certainly part of me, that finds some hope in this, because we were stuck. And now there's no guarantee that we will become unstuck, but there's a possibility. So much has changed. It suggests to us, wow, maybe more could change. Maybe this reality that we thought was fixed is malleable to our will after all.
So you mentioned healing a lot in your work, which I think, is sorely missing in a lot of bigger picture macro conversations, almost to the point where it's relegated to the kids' table at Thanksgiving dinner. The adults don't talk about stuff. We talk about the economy. We talk about, whatever. When in fact, I couldn't imagine any real attempt at progressive evolution without addressing that aspect of healing, not just individually, but collectively. So much trauma in the world, our entire existence is built on foundations of trauma. And it reminds me of addiction. When you hear people talk about addiction, again, in our world, it's been relegated to drugs and alcohol and maybe overeating and shopaholics. But when we really expand our understanding of addiction, we realize everything we do is addictive behavior, individually and collectively, and we're stuck in these patterns. So this period that shakes you up, like you're talking about, these periods of crises, why are they so valuable? Well, because often they shake you out of your slumber. And if you think about, let's say, 12-step, right? Like I think enough people are familiar at least with step one, right? You can't address a problem without acknowledging the problem. And I don't know if you could drill it down to one, but it certainly feels like we need to take that first step, again, collectively, to say, what is it that we're not acknowledging? What is this truth that we don't want to look in the mirror and say, okay, my name is Earth, and I'm a blankaholic. Where would you start the process? Let's say if you were tasked with a 12-step program for human beings.
I think it is a very good metaphor, addiction, and maybe even more than a metaphor for the human condition right now, or at least let me qualify that by saying the condition of civilization. There are some indigenous cultures who have been minimally affected by modernity, by market economies, by modern education, and so forth. But the bulk of humanity as a collective is in an addictive state, which means that we are trying to meet needs that cannot be met by the things that we're using to meet them. So, for example, economic growth, trying to meet well, for one, just like on a very practical level, the problem today is not actually scarcity. Even though there are hundreds of millions of people living in dire scarcity, the problem is the distribution of wealth. The problem is inequality. The problem is waste. The world wastes several times more food than is required to feed all the hungry people on Earth. But we try to grow our way out of these problems. The economic problem of debt right now, the enormous levels of debt that people are basically, in servitude to, in thrall to. Also, like, the only viable economic solution in our current setup is to grow our way out of debt. Anyway, but the basic pattern of trying to meet a need that is a genuine need. So in today's world, the need on an individual level is for community, for connection, for intimacy, for purpose. And these are not readily available when we are so cut off, so standardized, so have been made into subjects of a market, into consumers, into functionaries of one sort or another, where we look outside and do you know the name of every tree? Do you know what medicine it's used for? Do you know what kind of birds live there and what seasons? Are you in a web of relationship with it? Do you look out at faces every day beyond your own little family, who you know intimately and who know your story, and who are part of this web of relationships that makes you feel at home in the world? No, probably not. I know I don't. And that leaves me feeling, on some level, and I'm not like a miserable person, but on some level leaves me feeling lonely, alienated, not at home in the world, like not fully at home in the world, which is what wealth really is. Wealth is to be fully at home in the world. So lacking that, of course, people are seeking to control, to accumulate, to dominate, to make up for this cutoff from the source of real security, which is embeddedness, which is connection, by achieving more and more fake security, which is control. So this is the essence of civilization's addiction. It's the addiction to control. That's what technology is. Yeah, I could go on and on,
but it's interesting because it brings to mind a couple of things. First of all, we would say, if we were asked, the royal we, are you a scientific society, or are you a data-driven society, or are you a fact-driven society? We would say, of course we are. And so then you would say to that person, okay, well, let's use the United States as an example. For well over 100 years, the leader in GDP, the ultimate index, let's say, I would argue against that, but for this argument, we would say the ultimate metric of financial wealth. And the United States has led the world by an exponential rate for 100 years plus. So by far, the winners in this particular pursuit of financial wealth, yet also at the same time lead the world in rates of depression, alcoholism, drug addiction, incarceration, I could go on and on, murder, et cetera, et cetera. All by any objective standard considered the metrics of the unhealthiest of societies. And yet we're aware of that. That's not breaking news. We've known that for a while now. Yet it kind of reminds me of, those moving sidewalks at airports. It's like there's one that's moving towards a cliff, And even though we're having these discussions, we're like, yeah, I know it's pretty crazy. I hear you. But nobody knows how to stop it. Nobody knows what the fundamental move is to shift away from it. Because I think, to your point, and I think sadly, so many people feel how you feel, but they feel, ironically, alone, meaning, oh, it's just me and it's just a couple people. When I would imagine the data would tell us that well over the majority of the world feels that intuitively what you feel, not at home in the world, that something's not right. This isn't it. But I don't know whether we don't know how to articulate it, or we get gaslit when we go back out into the world telling us it's just us, we're crazy. But it would seem to me we have all the ingredients for this revolution of whatever we want to call it. Yet we kind of almost don't know where to start or how to start. Is that a fair way to characterize it?
Yeah, the system, as they call it, the machine has such inertia and is so vast and so powerful that there's no practical plan to stop the machine. There's no practical plan. In fact, I would say that there's no plan at all. Yet, something in us knows that it is possible. And that is a precious knowledge. Otherwise, if we didn't have something in us that knew that it was possible, why would we keep being hopeful? Anytime there's like a little break in the clouds, hope springs up. It was there all along. We know that it's possible, but we don't know how to get there. And I think that the path to get there has to start at a foundation of a different way of seeing the world, a different understanding of what the human being is, all of these questions I named as spiritual. Because when the new answers come in and the experiences come in that validate those answers, then you know you're not crazy. And it orients a person toward whatever action, large or small, is in service to that. I call it the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. Our minds might not know it's possible, but our hearts know it doesn't have to be this way. And you can make any argument why, human nature or the power elite, or patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, et cetera, like it's so powerful, we can't and I cannot refute your argument. All I can do is speak to the part of you that knows it doesn't have to be this way. And that urgently calls each one of us to act from that understanding.
It's very much, you referenced art earlier, and it just reminds me, or story or whatever it is, that maybe language is too limited or practicality is too practical to get to these essences that you're describing. It reminds me of after seeing the movie Avatar when it was out in, I think, 2009. And it really moved me in a lot of ways that predominantly were tied to the fact that there was this vision of a different world, a new world. And I've seen the movie multiple times since, and there's a lot of stuff that didn't stand up there. I was like, yeah, that was some pretty weak dialogue, or maybe the scene with, the unobtainium is okay. Maybe they could have done better. But in the end, at the time, I was moved to tears. There was something beyond the script, the acting, the whatever, that was so hopeful to me in a way that I hadn't experienced. And then and of course, there was this phenomenon going on around the world that, in fact, I think it was described in the media as, because of the blue nature of the people on Pandora, it was like the Avatar blues or whatever it was. And I remember, like, what are they talking about? And there was this whole collection of people that were suffering essentially depression because once they had that activated in them, and then they had to kind of go back into the quote unquote real world, it was just like, fuck, like, man, it was kind of that close. I see that, I felt that, and now I gotta whatever. And there's been other examples for me that occasionally stir that same level of hope that you're talking about, that intuitive hope that we get told all the time, especially after we're children, that that's crazy stuff. Magic is for idiots. Mysticism is whatever. And so we end up in this place, but maybe, and again, this is the ultimate irony, maybe the ultimate sign of hope is that despondency that you're talking about, that because it does, if I'm not healthy mentally, that can bring me into places that are, can be dark for a while. But to your point, it also then does remind me that there's why would that be there if it isn't trying to signal you as a compass almost to point you in a different direction?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the despondency is a necessary stage. It's when you realize that nothing that you already have been doing is going to work. And from your understanding of what's possible, it's hopeless. From who you've been being, it's hopeless. That is like the first step of, or maybe the second step of the 12 steps. Like you realize your powerlessness. But it doesn't end there. There's 10 more steps after that. And one of the things that happens is that you discover a much greater creative power that is not under your control, but comes through your participation in it. And this is actually there's another relation of this to the Avatar movie, because for me, the biggest flaw in the movie was that the world was saved when nature defeated man at his own game, at the game of violence, at the game of one force contending with another force. I think a more realistic path forward would be in that movie if those little milkweed fluffs penetrated the nervous systems of the soldiers so that when they destroyed the tree, they felt what the tree was feeling. And realized, wow, what I do to the world, I do to myself. We are inseparable. And I cannot, therefore, achieve what I want through dominating, through killing, through destroying. It's a change of heart in which hope lies. And this goes against some very deep programming. I was just with my son. First, we tried to watch The Mandalorian. He's 8. And I'm like, man, every single scene is sending you the message that the problem is a bad guy and the solution is to kill him. Every situation can be solved by violence. And he has this like superheroes book somebody gave him, the Marvel comic superheroes. Same message. The good guys, the bad guys, and salvation for the world comes because the good guys are stronger and bigger and have better weapons and they're tougher and more superpowers and they can destroy the enemy. This is a poison. This idea is a poison. We see it in politics. We see it, both sides saying, well, the problem is those horrible people on the other side who lack some basic aspect of humanity. They're some code word for evil. Ignorant, stupid. And a better world will come when we totally defeat those guys. We have war baked into the whole cake of civilization. I mean, it's even in physics, in technology, like the world is against us. The origin of the concepts of good and evil actually were in order and chaos, in domesticity and the wild. Good was domestic, evil was the wild. Good was the sheep, evil was the big bad wolf. Good was the king who killed the lions, cut down the forests, drained the wetlands. Like this attitude of conquest is at the core of what we need to overturn if we're going to have a world that's any different in any significant way than the world we have right now.
It's not a small pivot at times. And again, probably what contributes to people feeling, they don't know where to start or that hopelessness. But I am encouraged because more by conversations, to your point, that you have with people versus if you make the mistake of using, sort of, let's say, mainstream media or whatever as the barometer of kind of where we're at, it's easy to just believe, well, fuck it, like we're screwed. But when you do have these heart to hearts, if you will, with people that again share that intuition that there's something there, of course this isn't it, And it's interesting to me when you hear physicists talk about, they'll talk about the atom and say, well, yeah, the atom's like, matter is this part, and 99.9, we don't know what it is, it's empty. They'll talk about dark matter, they'll say, well, it's like, I don't know, we don't know what 95% of the universe is or whatever. And it would seem that somebody would jump in there and say, well, maybe that's what we should A, focus on, but B, that's what people have been calling God, or that's what people have been calling X, or the unknowable, and that there's just these silly ideas that are for kids, that we are limitless and infinite and eternal, are in fact not at all. They're actually the truest truths that could exist, except once you try to bring that up at a university, or at work, or at a cocktail party, you're the crazy guy. And I don't know how we bridge that exactly, but I still feel we will.
Mm-hmm. It has been changing. A number of years ago, I remember I was deplatformed. I was disinvited from a conference at I think it was the University of Oslo or something, because I had the word sacred in the title of my talk. And they're like, we're a humanist. We're a material, we're not a religious, we don't allow religious talks at our university. The idea that, again, reality is split into two, one of which is real and one is, fanciful. Mm-hmm. And that essentially what we call science has all of the foundations of knowledge under its domain. That itself actually is a religious ideology. We have the truth. We know how to get to the truth. It's a religious dogma, and it seemed to have been crumbling up until COVID, where then the whole world doubled down on a very narrow version of what science is. Like, so much is excluded, like 30, 40 years of the development of alternative and holistic medicine, just out the window. But yeah.
Well, I mean, from that perspective, it's interesting because I'll try to find a glass half full here, and this is more for my own personal therapy. That generally, when you see an aggressive stance, a heightened aggressive stance, let's call it, by an adversary, and I'm playing into the sort of the us versus them paradigm you're talking about earlier. But what I mean by this is that it could also be looked at as retreat, or everything but the kitchen sink, meaning that, and again, I don't want to get into kind of what's the cabal behind the curtain. Is it Count Chocula? Is it Mr. Burns? Is it, like whatever? I'm not interested in going there necessarily. But if there is a belief that there is a collective intuition that there's just so much more to life, and that we've been on this narrow band for so long, of course, some people are gonna naturally surmise that, well, there's people who are distracting us, or there's forces that are distracting us from that realization. But if you were to look at it from a grand scheme of things, then this particular period, although in the short term, which seems like, oh shit, we've taken one step forward and 10 steps back, to me sometimes reeks of desperation. That in fact, there's no holding back this realization of truth. Truth is truth. And even although it seems so dramatic in our few 80 years on the planet, or thousands of years of civilization, it's a blip relative to the grander scheme of things. And so it ends up being sci-fi and a lot of other things that can sometimes illustrate. I don't know. Have you ever seen The Last Mimsy?
No.
It's the body of the movie isn't, it is what it is, but there's two scenes, and they're not spoiler alerts, about what the book and the movie, and they're both from the future. And then of course they do a flashback for the rest of the movie. And it's this scene in a let's say a sort of a futuristic, I don't want to say utopian world, but there's a teacher outside with kids, and they're in this beautiful meadow, and it's just exactly what you maybe sort of imagine that world to be. And they're not talking. She's talking to them telepathically, first of all. And then she's telling them the story as to how they got to where they're at. Then they go through the whole flashback of the movie. And then the last scene of the movie, they all, wow, that was great, whatever. And then they all essentially levitate and fly away. And of course, it's fantasy, it's kid stuff, it's whatever, however it would be deemed. Every aspect of it to me feels like our natural destiny and progression. But of course, you're limited to where you could have that conversation and be taken seriously. But it does feel more today, for whatever reason, even though in the short term, there's days where, to your point at the beginning, you could talk to me tomorrow and I'd be like, this is bullshit. We're all fucked. But there's aspects of that limitlessness that have never felt more real to me than they do now. And for that, I feel blessed. Like, because the word, when you talk sacred, I mean, I understand why people have associated that with religion. But to me, if I was forced to take one word to say, okay, you got to pick one word, it's got to be that life is sacred, isn't it?
Yes, life is sacred. Matter is sacred. The world is sacred. You are sacred. Part of the dysfunction of civilization has come because we've exported sacredness onto something other than each other, the world, matter, life, the river, the ocean, the mountain, the forest, the trees, the whales. We got to actually hold matter sacred and become, I like to say, we need to be more materialistic and not treat matter as something inconsequential and not inherently valuable. Our civilization treats it as instruments of our utility, not as something with inherent worth of itself, but only its use value. And that gives us license to treat it as, nothing but a bunch of resources. And that also makes us feel alone here. Like when we don't recognize that we're among other sacred living beings, then we've rendered ourselves alone. And this goes to the root, to the core of scientific ideology, in which underneath all of these appearances of life, there's nothing but atoms and void. Generic building blocks in different permutations, that's it. At bottom, there's nothing sacred, nothing intelligent, nothing conscious. That despair infuses our whole civilization and drives an endless escapism, which is deeply related to not feeling at home here. And I guess, there's a whole tower built on this that ends up with, political polarization and the medical, biosecurity state and the conspiracy theories that you mentioned, where, it's Count Chocula who's at the root of it all, like this mentality of us versus them, good versus evil, conquest, domination. Of course, there must be a bad guy because things don't just happen by themselves. There's no intelligence in the world. So if bad things are happening, then it must be a bad guy who does it. Like this. I like to draw together all of these threads just to give a sense of how thorough the transition is that we face. That we are, as you were kind of saying, like we're standing at the brink of an incredible transformation. And it's not a guarantee, but we're not going to be, I don't think we're going to be rescued from having to make a choice about what world we want to live in. But we have an opportunity to choose a more beautiful one. We have the opportunity.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
Well, and one of the things that, and I mentioned to you before we started that, and if you haven't seen Charles's interview with Russell Brand on, is it Under the Skin, the name of his podcast? Yes, I believe it is.
I think that was it. Yeah.
And so it's on YouTube and it's fantastic. But I was encouraged that beyond the sort of the body of the conversation, that your work, your perspectives are continuing to bubble to that level of surface. That the reach, the fact that you're on his radar, you're on other people's radars now, that are looking to amplify your work and your perspectives without it being necessarily, and of course it's a personal compliment, but as an objective perspective, it's also to me really encouraging. Because again, there was a time where, to your point, you'd get taken off a conference in Oslo for mentioning the word sacred. There's still institutions where that would be the case, but there's also communities and places where that conversation is coming back. And you also used the word consciousness earlier. I remember interviewing Sir Roger Penrose, of the Penrose-Hawking theory. I mean, recent Nobel Prize winner in a lab for probably 60 years, Penrose-Hawking theory. And this guy, after, again, a long decorated career of theorizing about how the universe works, is like, well, and I'm oversimplifying it a little bit, but his essential conclusion was that, yeah, it turned out we were wrong. It's consciousness. Consciousness is the unified field. And of course, he was at a point in his career where he could take that level of risk and deal with the ridicule from his peers. But all of a sudden, and I don't want to just say it was him, there were people talking about that, Amit Goswami, other people for a long time. And I don't know about what your perspective is on this, but it feels to me that that bridge that, let's say, quantum physics provides, that all of a sudden there were these ethereal things that we couldn't pin down before, and that there's a certain part of that world that sees, maybe that's what that was. And hearing high-level physicists talking about consciousness potentially being the unified field has to be somewhat a good sign. Am I making too much of that?
No, I think it's very significant. There's the ideology of science that I was talking about before is crumbling from the inside, and not only because of quantum physics, although that's a big part of it, because quantum physics was the terminus of the reductionistic project, which sought to reduce complexity to simplicity. And the idea was we get to fundamental building blocks and deterministic relations between those building blocks, and our ability to predict the behavior of physical systems and therefore to control them would then reach its culmination. It would have no limit. If you can control something at the most minute level, then you're in control. You can dominate anything, like the body, for example. And instead of reaching that paradise of precision and understanding and control, what happened was we reached indeterminacy, where at the very base of everything was something that looked a lot like randomness, not determinism, where things just happened without a cause, where our whole, since Newton or even before, our whole scientific ideology was that things only happen if they're made to happen, when a force operates on something. But a uranium atom, there it is sitting there, and then all of a sudden it decays. Why? Why does it decay at this moment, not that moment? The old way of thinking says, well, something must have happened to it. Something must have, jostled it and knocked those protons loose from the nucleus. Something must have happened, right? Something must have changed. No, that's not how it is. It just happens randomly. There's a certain probability it'll happen at a certain amount of time. It just happens acausally. So the interpretation of physics was, okay, it's random. But there's another interpretation in which you can say that consciousness or choice is elemental, that the uranium atom chooses to decay at a certain time, that a photon chooses which slit or where to be diffracted to, which path to take. That choice is irreducible. And this is so hard, it's so alien to orthodox thinking that it still has, this interpretation does not come easily to the scientific mind. at this point. And that's just one of the revolutions in science. The other one is complexity theory, or another one is complexity theory, that order can come out of chaos, and that it's not something that we have to impose upon the world, and that we're not in an endless battle against entropy. And there's huge consequences of that too, which would take me an hour to flesh out. But yeah.
But I mean, it's good. I interviewed somebody again recently last year from the Max Planck Gravitational Institute for whatever physics in Germany, and this is not breaking news now, but it certainly was starting to become a bit of a ooh, that's surprising. Which she's the probably the leading advocate for the big bounce theory. And I was, big bounce, what is the big bounce theory? And of course, as she explained to us, the big bounce theory, essentially the best way to say it is it postulates infinity, meaning there was no beginning. The problem with the Big Bang theory was always somebody at some point is going to put their hand up and go, okay, what was before that? And there's we're working on that. That's a small piece of the puzzle we haven't filled in. But this big bounce theory, which is quickly accelerating and becoming, I think, the dominant theory at some point in the next decade, it is opening up more and more of the scientific world to this idea of infinite, no beginnings, no ends, less cause and effect, etc., which again I see as a good sign. So from that perspective, and not that we're going to do a Siskel and Ebert, for those people that don't remember Siskel and Ebert, you can Google it, but Charles and I go down the rabbit hole of various pop culture, and I would strongly encourage The Last Mimsy if you want to divert from Mandalorian for a while. It would be great for an 8-year-old to watch this. It's a kid's movie, but it's great. I think you'd love it. But I don't know if we've discussed this before, if you saw Westworld, but at the end of the second season of Westworld, and it is a bit of a spoiler, but it's not. The AI, the hosts, are trying to basically figure out, decode the humans. They've gotten all their data that they've stolen. They're trying to solve them, crack the humans, and they're at it forever. And then they ultimately come to some realization that they took the wrong path. And it's a great discussion dialogue at the end of the last episode of season 2, where Buddy goes, we thought there were these wildly complex beings, so we were, doing all this whatever crazy work. And then we actually realized, no, they're not at all. They're incredibly simplistic. And in fact, they're less than 10,000 lines of code. And, I'm no coder, but I would guess that's like a toaster. And the reason for that incredibly simplistic level of programming from their perspective was because they have one core drive: survival. So the belief in death drives every single decision a human being makes at some level, consciously or subconsciously. So we can't probably wrap this conversation as to, a paradigm shift in how we coexist in the world without discussing death. And it really does seem to be that elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. And if we're looking at the universe as potentially infinite, I think we'll get to a point where it's easier to see us as infinite, not necessarily as Charles or Richard, but as particles or whatever it is. Do you believe that transcending this fear and belief in this being who we are and the temporary period that we're here and the fear that comes with that inherently is necessary for us to be able to expand our horizons, if you will?
Yeah, that's it's very astute, I think, to point to survival and the fear of death as occupying a keystone place in our culture. I couldn't disagree more with the conclusion of the AIs in Westworld. I think it's obvious that human beings are not only motivated by survival and maximizing security and minimizing risk. People do all kinds of things altruistically all the time, which evolutionary science has tried to explain away as kind of malfunctions of the genetics, which, love is supposed to be to help your progeny survive. But sometimes it kind of misfires and you altruistically help somebody who doesn't have your genes. I mean, it's nice try. Human beings are not actually, even like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I think in a way is upside down. People do heroic things in the most extreme circumstances. And more generally, you can try it. I mean, you can verify this personally. See how you feel if you just dedicate yourself to being as safe as possible and not giving anything to the world, because why would you give anything if you could have more for yourself? That would make you a little less secure. Like, see how it feels.
I'm already depressed just by you saying it that way.
Yeah, you're not going to like it. You're going to recognize a drive in you to do more than that, to make the world beautiful, to do something better than you need to for the customer, for the market, for the money, because you're devoted to that thing in and of itself, whatever wants to be born through you, and whatever the world wants to be through your participation in it. This is a different story of what a human being is than the one that economics and genetics has narrated to us. So, so as far as death goes, our society and our belief systems make death a lot scarier. When we've been confined to a discrete, separate individual self, a economic man, a skin-encapsulated ego, a vessel of consciousness inside a flesh robot that is annihilated upon the death of the brain. Like, of course, death is scary. But there have been a lot of cultures who have had other understandings of what a human being is and what death is. Oh, but those are just primitive and superstitious. We're at the apex of knowledge. And they just didn't get it right. We know what a human being is now. Well, do we really? How much has to be excluded in order to maintain that view? A lot has to be excluded, like all the reincarnation research, like near-death experience research. I mean, there's voluminous documented research about this kind of stuff. And a lot of people have had personal experiences. I've had experiences that obliterate the story of self that I have received from the culture. A lot of people have those experiences, but you kind of keep those out into the spiritual realm, or like you were saying before, like you don't let the word healing get into the World Economic Forum or the academic conference or sacred, or spirituality. Like, we only maintain a world in which we enact the story of self-interest maximization to the detriment of this planet. We only maintain that by shutting out all of the data points that don't fit and all of the experiences that don't fit that narrow, confining story.
And one of my final recommendation is the OA. If you haven't watched the OA, it delves into that near-death experience in a way that's just, I couldn't do it justice in trying to describe it to you. But it's for me, it was transformational, transcendent, whatever word you would want to use. I couldn't think of a better, more encouraging way to end, Charles, than what again, you want to talk about astute. Turning the hierarchy of needs upside down, that's a good place to start. That's applicable. That's a practical tool people could actually use and sort of self-observe, because I do agree that in the end, we are what we believe we are. And for the longest time, to your point, culture has told us, and then therefore we've reinforced it, that we're greedy, that we're self-involved, that in the end, human nature, whenever the word human nature is used, it's almost always negative. And to your point, there's nothing but examples, or I don't want to say nothing but there are plenty of examples where we actually go against the programming, against what would be considered in our best self-interest to survive, and do things that have no rational reason in that context other than genuine love.
Yeah.
Or altruism.
And it's not that only rich people do it, or only affluent people who have taken care of all the other needs. No, in fact, I see it more in people whose existence is precarious. They are more generous. There's even academic research on this. The more money you have, the less generous you are on average.
Wow.
Wealthy people give a smaller percentage of their wealth to charity than poor people do. In one of my programs, this man from a favela in Brazil tells a story of his uncle who, like, dirt poor, like literally dirt poor, no floor, like poor. And anytime he came into any money, what would he do with it? If it was beyond his immediate needs, which happens sometimes, like you get some job for what, he would buy musical instruments and give them to the kids in the favela. It's not like he had his investment portfolio all set so that he could take the excess and do that with it. That came first. And when you hear that story, you recognize something that has been lost from our modern context. And you ask, what does he know? What kind of wealth is he in possession of that he can do that? Real wealth is the freedom to be generous, because I'm fine. I know I'm fine. Most people with a lot of financial wealth, a lot of money, they are not actually wealthy because they're not free. They're afraid. Most, not all. Yeah.
And that's, that's it. That is the definition of a mic drop, because that's it. That is it. I can't expand on that or improve on that. So I'll leave it at that. Charles, again, it's always a pleasure. I don't think I can overstate how I personally perceive the importance of your work. I'm super, again, beyond encouraged and excited and happy for you, but also just happy for us that's being further amplified. I see that as definitely a barometer of success for us collectively. Where can people find your work? And is there anything that you want to point people to that's coming up that they should be looking for?
Oh, people can just go to my website and discover whatever they're meant to discover there.
Well, I would strongly recommend the trip and exploring Charles's work, whether it's YouTube videos, TED Talks, essays, books. You'll be better for it. Your soul will be enriched, and I think therefore the people around you and the world at large will be better for it as well. So on that note, Charles, thanks again for helping us start this journey on a third way, and look forward to connecting with you again down the line.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I really enjoyed it as well.